the military machine that conquered the known world in less than 13 years. In the year 359 BC, in the kingdom of Macedonia, in what is now northern Greece, a young man named Philip inherited a throne on the edge of extinction. His brother, King Perdiccas III, had just been killed in battle by the Illyrians, and nearly the entire Macedonian army had been destroyed alongside him. The kingdom was surrounded by enemies on every side: Illyrians to the west, Thracians to the north, hostile Greek city-states to the south, and it had no army capable of stopping any of them. Philip was approximately 23 years old and had almost nothing to work with. What Philip did have was a memory. As a teenager, he had spent 3 years as a political hostage in the city of Thebes, where he had personally observed the military training methods of the general Epaminondas, the most innovative tactical mind in the Greek world, the man who had shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC. Philip remembered everything he had seen and came home determined to apply it. He began with 4,000 recruits drawn from the Macedonian peasantry and equipped them with a new weapon that no Greek army had ever used at scale: a double-pointed pike called a sarissa, measuring between 18 and 20 feet in length, more than 3 times the length of a traditional Greek spear. It had to be carried in 2 halves and assembled before battle. It required 2 hands to wield, which meant a smaller shield. But in a tight formation, with the pikes of the first 5 rows all projecting beyond the front line simultaneously, it produced something that had never existed before: a wall of iron points that no conventional infantry could approach and survive. Philip called his new soldiers the pegetairoi, the foot companions. Within 2 years of taking the throne that everyone expected him to lose, he had built something the ancient world had never seen: a professional army that trained year-round, drilled continuously, and owed its loyalty entirely to him. One father turns farmers into the world's best soldiers. In 338 BC, at a place called Cheronea in central Greece, Philip II of Macedonia put his reformed military to its ultimate test against the most powerful army that the Greek world could assemble, a coalition of Athens and Thebes. Among the Theban forces was a unit called the Sacred Band, 300 men, organized as 150 pairs of lovers, bonded by the theory that no man would flee or surrender in front of his partner. They had never been defeated in battle. They would not survive the afternoon. Philip did not simply invent a new weapon. He reinvented the entire structure of what an army could be. The Macedonian military under Philip was the first genuinely professional standing force in Greek history. Paid continuously, trained throughout the year, drilled in complex maneuvers that part-time militia forces could never attempt. He funded it from silver mines at Mount Pangaeum, which generated enough revenue to maintain a permanent force without depending on seasonal conscription. The phalanx itself was organized with mathematical precision. 16 men deep by 16 men wide formed a unit of 256 soldiers called a syntagma. 6 syntagmata formed a battalion of roughly 1,500 men. The weapons of the first 5 rows all projected beyond the front of the formation simultaneously, meaning that an advancing phalanx presented more spear points than the enemy had available targets. The equipment weighed approximately 40 pounds per man, 10 pounds less than standard Greek hoplite gear, which gave the Macedonian infantrymen greater mobility without sacrificing effectiveness. Complementing the phalanx was an elite cavalry unit called the companion cavalry, the hetairoi, recruited from the Macedonian nobility and organized into 8 territorial squadrons of 200 to 300 horsemen each. These were not skirmishers. They were heavy shock cavalry designed to charge in a tight wedge formation and break through infantry formations at full speed. The infantry fixed the enemy in place. The cavalry delivered the killing blow from the side or rear. At Cheronea, the sacred band of Thebes fought until every last one of its 300 members was dead where he stood. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support, and let's continue. A 20-year-old king crosses into Asia. In 336 BC, Philip II was assassinated by a Macedonian nobleman named Pausanias while entering the theater at the royal city of Aegae for a wedding celebration. He was stabbed before his bodyguards could intervene and died immediately. His son Alexander was 20 years old. Within days, the Macedonian army proclaimed him king. Within months, he had suppressed rebellions across Greece with calculated brutality, including the complete destruction of Thebes, in which 35,000 Thebans were enslaved and the city was razed to its foundations. Only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. The message to every other Greek city that might consider rebellion was unambiguous. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander led his army across the Hellespont, the narrow strait of water separating Europe from Asia, now called the Dardanelles, and stepped onto the soil of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. He crossed with approximately 40,000 men, 12,000 Macedonian infantry divided between the phalanx and the elite hypaspists, 7,000 Greek allied hoplites, 7,000 Thracian and Balkan levies, 5,000 Greek mercenaries, and approximately 6,000 cavalry, including the 1,800 companion horsemen, who would prove decisive in every major battle that followed. Before the army marched inland, Alexander visited the site of ancient Troy. He placed a wreath on the tomb that tradition identified as belonging to Achilles, his personal hero, and reportedly declared that Achilles had been fortunate to have a poet like Homer to preserve his memory. Then he drove his own spear into the Asian soil and declared the land conquered territory. He was 22 years old. He had never fought a major battle on foreign soil. He owed an enormous debt. Philip had left the treasury nearly empty, and his supply lines were already stretched. He had exactly one military asset that no Persian commander had encountered: the system that Philip had built and that Alexander had spent his entire life learning to use. The river that first proved the system unbeatable. In May of 334 BC, at a river called the Granicus in northwestern Anatolia, now the Biga River in Turkey, near the site of ancient Troy, Alexander's army faced its first major test against the Persians. The Persian force waiting for them on the eastern bank was not the main imperial army. It was a coalition of the local satraps, the provincial governors of Asia Minor, supported by a large force of Greek mercenary infantry. According to the historian Arrian, the Persian force numbered approximately 40,000 men, slightly larger than Alexander's. A Greek mercenary commander named Memnon of Rhodes, one of the most capable military minds in Persian service, advised the satraps to avoid a pitched battle entirely. His recommendation was to burn the crops, destroy the food supplies, empty the territory, and let starvation and supply failure do what Persian cavalry could not. The satraps refused. They could not bring themselves to destroy their own provinces, and they calculated that Greek warfare was superior to whatever the young Macedonian was bringing. Both assumptions proved fatal. Alexander's second in command, Parmenion, recommended waiting until the following morning before crossing the river. Alexander overruled him and ordered an immediate attack. He personally led the companion cavalry across the river under intense Persian fire, charged up the steep eastern bank, and drove straight into the Persian cavalry on the right. During the fighting, a Persian satrap named Spithridates brought a curved blade down onto Alexander's helmet, cutting it and drawing blood from his scalp. A second Persian raised his sword for a finishing blow. Alexander's companion, Clytus, cut off the attacker's arm at the shoulder. The Persians were routed. Approximately 20,000 Greek mercenaries who had served the Persian cause were captured and sent to Macedonia in chains. Alexander's calculated message that Greeks who fought for Persia would be treated as traitors rather than prisoners of war. Asia Minor was now opened. The first test of the system had worked precisely as designed. The king who always led from the front. In the ancient world, kings often commanded their armies from positions of relative safety, elevated ground protected by bodyguards, far enough from the fighting to observe and direct. Alexander the Great did the opposite. In every major engagement of his 13-year campaign, he positioned himself at the critical point of attack, personally led the decisive cavalry charge, and fought in close combat against men who were actively trying to kill him. The physical record of what this cost him is documented in ancient sources. At the Granicus in 334, he took a sword cut to the scalp. At the siege of Gaza in 332, a catapult bolt went through his shoulder. During the campaign in Bactria and Sogdiana in 329, he suffered serious leg wounds. During the siege of a city of the Mali people in India in 325, he personally jumped over the city wall ahead of his troops, landed alone inside the enemy fortification, and was struck by an arrow that pierced through his armor into his lung. He collapsed. His officers scrambled over the wall in a panic, killing everyone around him, and carried him out. He was believed dead for hours. The reason Alexander led from the front was not personal recklessness, though he was genuinely fearless. It was a calculated leadership strategy that his army expected and depended on. Macedonian kingship required the king to demonstrate his worth through personal courage. An army that watched its king charge into the decisive moment of every battle would follow him anywhere. An army that watched its king direct from a hill while others died would eventually stop following. His cavalry charge at Gaugamela, galloping directly at the position of Darius III himself, cutting through the Persian bodyguard, heading straight for the king of the largest empire in the world, was not impulsive. It was the execution of a tactical decision made in real time during a battle. It was also terrifying. When Darius saw Alexander coming for him personally, he ran. Darius flees twice and loses everything. On November 5th, 333 BC, on the coastal plain near the village of Issus in what is now the Hatay province of southern Turkey, Alexander fought the Persian emperor Darius III for the first time in a direct confrontation. After the defeat at the Granicus, Darius had spent more than a year assembling a massive force from across his empire. Estimates range from 100,000 to numbers that ancient sources inflated into the hundreds of thousands. He maneuvered his army to cut Alexander's supply line from the north, forcing Alexander to countermarch and fight on ground of Darius's choosing. What Darius did not understand was that the narrow coastal terrain between the sea and the mountains of Cilicia canceled the advantage of his superior numbers. The Persian lines could not outflank the Macedonians because there was nowhere to go. Alexander placed Parmenion and the Thessalian cavalry on the left flank near the sea, the phalanx across the center, and himself with the companion cavalry on the right. He personally located the position of Darius's royal chariot in the center of the Persian line and directed his charge toward it. As Alexander crashed through the Persian left flank and wheeled toward the center, Darius watched the Macedonian king coming for him through the chaos of battle. He turned his chariot and fled. With the emperor gone, the army dissolved. Darius left behind his mother Sisygambis, his wife Statera, his daughters, and the imperial treasury. Alexander treated the royal women with careful respect, a calculated demonstration that surrender would be honorable. Darius subsequently offered Alexander enormous territorial concessions and a massive ransom for his family. Alexander refused. 2 years later, at Gaugamela in 331 BC, the same thing happened on an even grander scale. Darius assembled the largest army in Persian history, on terrain he had specifically prepared to his advantage. Alexander charged for Darius again. Darius fled again, this time abandoning everything including his empire. He was assassinated by his own satrap Bessus in 330 BC. A 7-month siege ends with 30,000 enslaved. In January of 332 BC, Alexander's army arrived at the walls of Tyre, the most important commercial city in Phoenicia, located partly on the mainland and partly on an island approximately 800 meters offshore, separated from the coast by the Mediterranean Sea. Tyre's seawalls on the island portion rose to approximately 45 meters. The city had withstood every siege in its history. It had repelled Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. It had no reason to fear a land army with no significant naval force. Alexander sent envoys requesting peaceful entry and permission to offer sacrifices at the temple of the god Melkart. Tyre refused and offered nominal neutrality, which both sides understood as a refusal. Alexander had a strategic problem. Without Tyre, the Persian fleet could use its harbor to threaten his rear and potentially land troops in Greece. He could not advance eastward with an enemy naval base behind him. He could not ignore the city. His solution was engineering on a scale the ancient world had rarely attempted. He ordered the construction of a causeway, a mole of earth, stone, and timber, stretching from the mainland to the island, 800 meters across open water. Workers quarried stone from the ruins of the old mainland city of Tyre, cut timber from the forests of Lebanon, and drove the construction forward while Tyrian forces attacked from the walls with artillery, arrows, fire ships, and swimming raiders. It took 7 months. In July of 332 BC, after finally assembling a fleet from Phoenician and Cypriot cities that had already submitted, Alexander breached the walls from both sea and land simultaneously. 6,000 Tyrians were killed during the assault inside the city. 2,000 men of military age were crucified along the beach. 30,000 Tyrians, women, children, and others, were sold into slavery. Of the 40,000 who had lived there when the siege began, virtually none remained. The battle that broke the largest empire on Earth. On October 1st, 331 BC, at a place called Gaugamela, near what is now the city of Mosul in northern Iraq, Alexander the Great fought the decisive battle of his life. Darius III had used more than a year since his defeat at Issus to assemble the largest army the Persian Empire had ever put into the field. Drawing cavalry from Bactria, scythed chariots designed to shred the Macedonian phalanx, a small force of war elephants and infantry from every province of an empire that stretched from Egypt to India. Modern historians estimate the Persian force at somewhere between 100,000 and 250,000 men. Alexander had approximately 47,000. Darius had also chosen and prepared the ground specifically. He selected a vast, flat plain where his numerical superiority and his scythed chariots could operate freely. He even had his engineers level portions of the terrain in advance to remove obstacles. His strategy was to overwhelm Alexander's smaller force by simultaneous attacks on both flanks, while the chariots carved through the phalanx in the center. Alexander formed his army into an innovative box formation, a double phalanx with units angled to the rear on both sides to prevent encirclement, with the companion cavalry on the right under his personal command. When the Persian scythe chariots charged the phalanx, Alexander had trained his men to open their ranks and let the chariots pass through harmlessly, then close the formation behind them and kill the chariot crews. Darius's most feared weapon was neutralized before it made contact. As the battle developed and Persian cavalry surged around both Macedonian flanks, threatening to encircle the army, Alexander watched the Persian left and center for the gap that the cavalry's movement would create. When he saw it, he wheeled the companion cavalry from column into line and led a full charge directly at Darius's personal position. Darius saw the wedge of armored horsemen, with Alexander at the point coming straight at him, and fled in his chariot for the second time. His army shattered. Babylon surrendered. Susa surrendered. The Persian Empire ceased to exist as a political entity in the space of a single afternoon. 200 war elephants almost stopped the Macedonians. In May of 326 BC, at the Hydaspes River in what is now the Punjab region of Pakistan, Alexander's army faced something it had never successfully confronted in 8 years of continuous warfare. An organized force of war elephants deployed in a defensive line. King Porus of Parava had approximately 200 of them. Positioned across his front, each animal carrying a crew of soldiers and armored with protective cloth. Behind the elephants, infantry. Behind the infantry, chariots and cavalry. The Hydaspes River itself, the modern Jhelum, was running high with the monsoon rains that had been falling for weeks. Porus had studied Alexander's tactics. He knew the Macedonian pattern. Phalanx fixes the enemy. Cavalry charges the flank, the enemy breaks. He positioned his elephants specifically to neutralize the cavalry charge. Trained war horses will not advance into a line of elephants. The smell and the noise drive them to panic. Porus had effectively eliminated Alexander's hammer. Alexander spent days observing the enemy position and feinting at crossings to keep Porus uncertain. He selected a crossing point approximately 27 kilometers upstream, hidden by an island in the river, and crossed before dawn in a monsoon thunderstorm. By the time Porus knew what had happened, Alexander was already across with his best troops and attacking his flank. The battle that followed was the hardest fighting of the entire campaign. Alexander's archers, Cretans and Macedonians, shot the crew members riding the elephants. Without handlers, the enormous animals turned, panicked, and began crushing their own troops. Alexander's infantry formed a circular wall, interlocking shields, and the elephants hammered themselves against it without breaking it. Porus was wounded in the shoulder but kept fighting from his elephant until the battle was lost. He was one of the few enemies Alexander ever fought who impressed him without reservation. Alexander returned his kingdom to him and named him a satrap. The unstoppable army finally refuses to go further. In the late summer of 326 BC, on the eastern bank of the Hephaestus River, the modern Beas River in the Indian state of Punjab, the army of Alexander the Great stopped. It was the first and only time in 13 years of campaigning that Alexander's forces refused to advance. He had just defeated Porus. He wanted to continue east to the Ganges River, which Greek geographic knowledge described as emptying into the ocean at the edge of the world. He believed, or claimed to believe, that if he reached it, he would have conquered everything worth conquering. His men had a different assessment. They had been marching and fighting continuously since 334 BC. They had covered more than 20,000 miles. They had fought at the Granicus, at Issus, at Gaugamela, at Tyre, at Gaza, through Persia, through Bactria, through the mountains of what is now Afghanistan and Tajikistan, through the Hindu Kush, and across India. Thousands were dead. Thousands more were wounded or ill. They were in a country of monsoon rains, disease, unfamiliar food, and enemies whose numbers the local populations described as vastly larger than anything they had yet faced. A general named Conus spoke for the army and said what needed to be said. He praised everything they had accomplished. He said that the men had given everything they had to give. He told Alexander they had reached their limit. Alexander went into his tent and stayed there for 3 days, waiting to see if his silence and absence would change their minds. The army held its position. Alexander emerged and announced that the gods had decided the campaign would end at the Hyphasis. He built 12 altars to the 12 Olympian gods at the river's edge, monuments to mark the eastern boundary of his conquests, and turned back toward Babylon. He died there in June of 323 BC at age 32 or 33 of a fever that lasted 10 days. He left no named successor. The most powerful military machine the ancient world had ever produced dissolved almost immediately into civil war among the men who had served it.